This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and this is the Prairie Monk program. This is WEFT's weekly look at the environment and rails to trails and conservation and anything else that Dave feels like talking about. Today is Sunday, July the 9th, 2017, and Dave has some special guests today who have an event coming up this afternoon.
Yes, we have Kirby and Sydney Pringle. And they have interesting backgrounds, and we'll talk about them in a moment. I first want to say a few things. I want to thank Elizabeth Kirby for driving the float van in the parade. I worked as a Prairie Monk. That's our nom de plume for this program. And not everyone recognizes why I'm there with cloak and hat like Francis of Assisi, but when you get to the Lincoln Avenue corner, there's a lot of Urbana people seem to be attuned to the fact that we are the Prairie Monk, just that my name is Monk, and we take advantage of that. I was pleased to be there and just interact with people who know what we do and try to do. There's some historic events floating around. One is Centerville Church. You guys might know the Centerville Church. It's called Lickskillet. It was a subdivision out there by White Heath that was anticipating that the railroad would come through, but it didn't. So it had been all platted out, and there's a Methodist church that's been there since 1867 or something like that. And it's still in the plat. It's just a little bit north of Shady Rest, and it has a lot of flatlands around it, and a hill which probably is part of the Cerro Gordo Moraine. And it's been in action for a long time, so I had a lot of local people there, and we like to celebrate these things every once in a while. There's a little cottage at Piment where Douglas and Lincoln got together, and all the records seem to indicate that. And that little house has been cared for by Piment for many, many years, and it looks as if it's made it to the federal list of historic places. So that's being celebrated at the moment. There's another interesting person passed this week. It was Sandy Roberts. She was known to a lot of people because she was a facilitator of events at Levis Center. But she was also a secretary for the Historic Museum on University Avenue that was there for many years. And she also had a lot to do with promoting volunteer Illini activities. But she was a Piment person, not a Piment person, a Monticello person. So we like to remind you of these situations so that you can be there and enjoy and know a little bit more about them. So let's introduce Cindy and Kirby Pringle and where they come from and what they do. They live in little towns around. Why don't we start with you, Cindy? Cindy's here with a jacket that's absolutely covered with butterflies. And they have in front of them a little cage that has monarch butterfly larvae or caterpillars there. And
in case you get hungry, we thought we'd bring them if you wanted some lunch.
Well, Australian Aboriginals actually enjoy eating beetle larvae.
Yeah. Tasty.
Yes, and also very proteinaceous. So they're healthy. And these characters, I don't know whether we can see them. We'll put a picture of them up if we can find. But they have a very interesting stripy body. and they have a fantastic chrysalis, which is all nicely ornate with dots around it. It's just fantastic. And how do you do this? You bring in the eggs that you find on the leaves?
Yes, we look for monarch eggs. They're usually on the underside of a leaf, and it's about the size of a pinhead, kind of a pearly white color, but with little ridges shaped like a football. And so we bring in those little eggs and raise them. We feed the caterpillars milkweed and raise them until they become butterflies.
And we also look for caterpillars. We don't just look for eggs. We also look for caterpillars when we're out when we're out caterpillar hunting. When we put our safari suits on and our pith helmets.
So are you looking for a certain type of milkweed? Or is it just...
We do. We find most of the monarchs on common milkweed and swamp milkweed are the two.
Swamp milkweed is down low.
And they tend to use common milkweed early in the season. Swamp comes up a little bit later. And so their second part of their season, they seem to focus more on swamp milkweed, although they'll still eat common. But sometimes we find them on butterfly weed, but not nearly as often as swamp and common milkweed.
And I was going to mention that the flowers of the common milkweed are fantastic fragrance. I describe it between lilacs and honeysuckle. It's fabulous. And the swamp milkweed flowers, on the other hand, smell like bubble gum.
So we get our food fixation as we could just take sniffs and think, ugh, smells good.
You get high in the brain.
I don't need lunch anymore. So,
which reminds me that there is a little wetland on the Big Dig on 2nd Street, and it almost faces up to University Avenue. And if you go past Habitat for Humanity on University Avenue, look right, there's I think there's some swamp milkweed and there's some regular milkweed, and there's also cardinal flowers. And I'm feeling sorry for it at the moment because it's been rather dry.
Yeah.
And even the prairie is drying up. And sometimes when you make an artificial pond or an artificial wetland, it doesn't always have the quality of soil that you had when the topsoil was there. So I hope some of you go over there and have a look. It might even be that you could secrete a milkweed caterpillar in there.
You might, yeah. And swamp milkweed and cardinal flowers need moisture, so hopefully they'll.
Oh yes, oh no, I'm afraid of the cardinals because
they'll get some rain, or someone with a big sprinkling can will come over and water them. But yeah, that's one of the worries. But as you know, a lot of native plants are drought resistant once their roots are established,
Yes.
and they have deep tap roots, and they can make it through a usual drought. If it's a harsh drought, it'll affect it also. But some of the prairie plants were evolved to get through dry times.
And right now, on Lake Park, I was there last night, and they're feeling rather droopy, but they'll survive, whereas some of your cultivar plants will not survive, and they need water or irrigation or something like that. The monarch butterfly that you're referring to in Australia is referred to as a wanderer butterfly. That's because they do wander. Tell us a little bit of the history, and you probably know it pretty well, where they go, where they come from, and what they're about, and how long do they last?
The general life history of the monarch butterfly seems to be that there's a population in central Mexico that never migrates. They always stay in central Mexico. And then there's also a population in South Florida that never migrates. And then you have the migrating population in North America that there's 4 generations of monarchs, and it's that overwintering generation in central Mexico is the 4th generation. And in February and in early March, when the sun gets at the correct angle, they head north to Texas, and they start laying eggs. And sometimes on a good breeze, they'll make it clear to central Illinois. We've had a few butterflies get a good tailwind, so to speak, and we'll make it all the way from Mexico to Illinois. And that happened, this was a freak year that happened. We saw our first monarch butterfly April 23rd, which was highly unusual, very early. We don't usually see them until mid-May, early May, mid-May is usually when we see monarchs. And that
I have to correct you. I think it was April 13th.
Oh, 10 days earlier.
April
I
13th.
believe April 13th.
It was even earlier than I knew there was a 3 in there. So April 13th is incredibly early to
That
spot
has to be a migrating butterfly, not a
Yeah, that
one
was
that's born here.
Yeah, that was one that got a big tailwind, and that happened, I think, all along Nebraska to Illinois. That there was a big wind from the south and blew a lot of those 4th generations.
Sometimes that can be to their disadvantage. The climate will be too much for the butterflies. I've been on Popocatépetl, I think, is a mountain outside of Mexico, and I think that's where the permanent population is. You're saying that permanent population is migratory first, so the 4th year they stay there?
Yeah, there's 4 generations per year of monarchs, and it's the 4th generation that spends its time. There's 12 overwintering sites in central Mexico, and some are bigger than others, but El Rosario is probably the largest. And then that generation, when they leave in February and March and lay eggs in Texas and Oklahoma, that is then the 1st generation, and that 1st generation continues its journey north. And as they continue their journey north, they lay eggs along the way in places like Missouri and Indiana and Illinois. And then, so we tend to see usually 1st or 2nd generation monarchs in Illinois. But they keep working their way north to southern Canada until they reach that 3rd generation, which lays eggs in August, September, and even into October. And then that will turn out to be the 4th generation, which in turn will fly will get as far as southern Canada in the upper Midwest. And then in September, mid-September, it works its way south. That 4th generation of the monarch has an overwintering strategy like a bird. That's how they survive the cold weather. They fly south to Mexico, whereas some species of butterflies, like the black swallowtail, will overwinter as a chrysalis. But the monarch is a little different. And there are other butterflies that do migrate that can't stand the winters as a chrysalis in Illinois, and they'll fly just as far south as they need to, but they don't fly in big giant groups like they fly more as individuals.
Say something about the group activity. I was in a cemetery at Arcola once, and there's a tree there that they seem to congregate on, and it was absolutely all orange.
Yeah.
And they seem to do that in other places.
Yes. Was that in September probably, or?
I don't remember. I could research it.
It probably was. And that's, we used to live near Pasodum, and every September, we were on a flyway, a migration flyway, and the monarchs would land in our trees and spend the night. We had half an acre of reconstructed prairie, and they would get up in the morning and they'd nectar on that goldenrod and get their energy for the day and try to fatten up, and then they'd fly on to south as a group. They flew as a group, and that happened until about 2008, when there was a steep decline in their population, and that's when we stopped really seeing them migrate in the big numbers. Then it started happening in just groups of 2, 3, 4, 5 butterflies. You wouldn't see the big groups that would hang from the branches like you had been.
Oh, okay. So do they fly like geese fly? They change leadership, so the one goose doesn't have to always face the wind. Does the population of insects move around to be? How do they fly? Do you know?
When we've seen them, they tend to fly almost in formation.
Yes, that's what I'm wondering.
And there may be one leader that gets tired, but they do tend to, I think, follow maybe someone that's got the best. They tell direction from the direction of the sun, and they also have a built-in clock in their head. And so, if you can tell time and you know where the angle of the sun, you can tell direction. And so that's how they use they know they can count the time and look at the angle of the sun, and so then they know what direction to go.
So on a dull day, they stay at home and they stay in the tree?
They'll stay at a tree overnight. They don't tend to fly at night. They will sometimes if they're frightened or stirred up, but generally they'll rest overnight in a tree, and then they'll nectar the next day and then fly on and repeat that. They'll stop 20, 30 miles away. They fly at an average of 12 to 15 miles an hour. Is that correct?
I'm not sure the miles per hour.
Yeah, it depends on the wind. If they get a good tailwind, obviously they're going to go faster. If they have a headwind, they'll be much slower and won't make as much headway. But they can make, in a good breeze, they can make 50 miles a day. It takes them, once they leave central Illinois in mid-September, it takes them 2 months to reach their overwintering sites in central Mexico. So it's approximately 2,000 miles in 2 months, and so I'd have to divide that in my head to see how far they travel.
That comes to about 30 miles a day.
Yep. So 30 miles a day.
Wow.
Pretty good for an insect that weighs less than a gram.
Yes. What is their life expectancy? Do you know how long they?
The generations that stay here, the first, second, and third, average about, what would you say, 2 to 6 weeks? But the overwintering generation, because they have to migrate and then in turn begin their return trip, is probably about 6 to 9 months. Mm-hmm. So they're a lot longer lived than the other generations.
Yeah, and that fourth generation is sexually immature. They gain as much weight as they can during their flight. They actually do gain weight during their flight. And then they just, in their overwintering areas, it's one of the reasons they go there, it's like a constant 55-degree microclimate. And so it's cool enough. They're not very active. They don't hibernate per se, but they're very still on the trees. But on warm days, when the sun comes out and water trickles down the mountain, they'll gather around the puddles and drink. They need moisture. And
they're puddle jumpers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they puddle jump. They need some moisture in the.
They have a long proboscis. You can see the proboscis.
Yes.
Do you know their anatomy?
I do know a male from a female, but I've never seen the genitalia.
You can check it out from the wings.
Yeah. Yeah, the wings, the males have 2 black dots on either side of their abdomen, and the females have thicker lines on their wings. And the male tends to be a little bit bigger, but the female has thicker wings. Some studies have shown that the females actually fly more efficiently, that those thicker wings can somehow give her more lift, and she can fly more efficiently.
And an interesting thing, too, about the proboscis, when they emerge from the chrysalis, it's actually split. And as they develop, it comes together and becomes like a straw.
Makes a tube.
Yes, a tube. And on occasion, if that doesn't occur, then they can't survive because they don't have a way of feeding. So it's kind of a rare, sometimes they don't make it.
Yeah, they call that zipping.
Zipping.
Yeah, they call that zipping when they put the two halves of their proboscis together. They zip it.
Now, do they have predators? Do they contain a chemical element that is rather nauseating to birds or other creatures that might take them over? Do they have other organisms that know monarchs and either avoid them or utilize them as food?
There are because they eat the milkweed plant exclusively. The milkweed has a number of toxins in it, and so as a caterpillar, it ingests these toxins, which makes it poisonous, distasteful to other, like birds. Don't generally eat the monarch caterpillars, and as an adult butterfly, they won't eat them. I think studies have shown, like a blue jay perhaps trying to eat a monarch butterfly and then throwing up afterwards because of the toxins. But the eggs and the caterpillars at those stages, they do have predators. There's the
lacewing larva that can actually suck the insides out of the egg. And if you look closely, sometimes it just looks like a little hollow egg because the larva has sucked to the innards out of it.
Suck the egg and yolk out of the egg, so it's just an empty casing. So those are one of the smaller predators they have to deal with. And then there's assassin beetles and stink bugs. In our area, stink bugs are probably the biggest predator of monarch caterpillars. They hang out on milkweed looking for caterpillars, and they have a long stinger, sword-like.
Yes, the Hemiptera is their order, and they have that sucking beak.
Sucking tube, and they'll grab a monarch and insert that into their skin and start sucking them, sucking the insides out of them. And so, but that's, and then the other enemy that they have is called the tachnid fly, and it will come and lay eggs it'll insert its eggs into the monarch caterpillar, where the eggs will grow and basically turn into larvae and eat the caterpillar from the inside. Sort of like Alien, when they, very much like that. And then the larvae will form eggs, and then they'll emerge. They'll push themselves out of the gut of the monarch caterpillar and become eggs, and then they'll hatch into the flies.
So the prairies that we have where these milkweed plants are very various, and so you have to know that there is an ecology of one creature living on another creature. Sometimes when we plant a prairie, we have to be careful not to overload it with one species, because that might mean that there's one interaction and you don't get the biodiversity that you're looking for. So how do you have grown up with these creatures, but we have to realize that there are 2,000 different species on the prairie. That's species of insects. And you have a conflict here about public being very concerned about one individual creature that they see fairly easily. But some of the creatures you're talking about are very small. You almost need a microscope or a lens to see them. And one of the things we need to emphasize in our discussion is when people are putting in prairie gardens, that they realize that there's biodiversity, and the bigger the garden, the better. You can do 10 or 15 species in a 10 by 10, but it's better to have a little more if you can. And if you can put in a prairie, it's been common to grow grasses because they grow quickly and they look nice and they wave their wooden leg in the air and the wind blows and they're attractive, and that is what people think is a prairie. But there are, if you have a big area like 10,000 acres, you will find perhaps 110 different species of broadleaf plants there, and each one of them has a relationship to an insect or a snake or a bird. And yes, I was at the farmer's market yesterday, and people were selling bird seed for birds, and there were things that you could hang on a tree. And I had to say, but our prairies don't have any trees. How do you provide for the birds that are in the prairie? And so very, very interesting. And now you have made records of these creatures, and you have films that say something about them. And one of them is going to be, two of them are going to be shown at the Virginia Theatre in Champaign today at 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock, yeah.
Say something about both those projects.
I'll talk about my film, and my film kind of touches on what you've just mentioned, that I emphasize the need for habitat, and the monarch is sort of a symbol in many ways of what's gone wrong with the native prairie habitat. With it's had a steep decline in population over the last 20 years. It's lost 90% of its numbers, and the reason for that is the loss of habitat, as Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready beans have been planted and sprayed. You don't see milkweed in fields anymore like you used to, and farmers are mowing what ditches they have. And so what prairie plants we did have 20 years ago, you're not seeing them nearly as much because of the Roundup that's being sprayed and the ditch mowing that takes place. And so, and I think people in Illinois, we have no reference of what a tall grass prairie looked like. It's all gone,
Yes, that's why we run around trying to say remnant prairies on railroad beds.
It was obliterated, in 100 years. It was gone.
Well, we're still obliterating it. We have a wonderful trail coming in to Kickapoo, and it's so wide it's taking out all the prairie on either side.
Yeah, and so that's really what we look at in our film is the need. We have to create habitat if we want to save these pollinators, because 70% of all plants are pollinated, insect pollinated, and 30% of the food we eat is insect pollinated. And then those plants, if they can't survive, they don't make the fruits, nuts, and berries that are needed for the birds and the ground nesting mammals. And so the whole thing falls apart.
Yes, and that is encouraged by the planting of grass prairies that are wind pollinated and not involving pollinators. You seem to have been in contact with the pollinatarium and the people that run the pollinatarium, and you know about May Barramom, who was a WEFTY at one stage and had a program here on gnats and insects or whatever, and so are you part of a community that is concerned about the things that you're interested in?
Well, I think so. We're not. We joined a Champaign County pollinator group that it was formed by the Prairie Rivers Network, and so it's a loose coalition of people who are concerned about the demise and population of bees and butterflies and even moths. A lot of people don't think of moths as being pollinators, but they're an important part of the. Some flowers can only be pollinated at night, that open at night, and so moths fill that role. And so it's an organization that I think they're trying to educate people and do some events and encourage pollinator gardens and try and encourage the railroad and the departments of transportation to not mow the roadsides as much as they have, to try to help. Because, you know, when I mentioned that the monarch population has gone down 90%, I think that's really true of most of the bee and moth and insect populations in general have declined precipitously.
That's important to say, perhaps at this stage, that there's a concern with May Berenbaum, who is head of the Department of Entomology, but there's also a natural history survey. And just this week, somebody went to a garage sale and found a sequence of bees that were insects that were recorded, and it must have been a part of a research organization. So behind or what we're talking about is a research organization that tries to find out what is happening, even to the wonderful idea that the monarch might have a brain and that it might work in certain ways. It gets to be that with nanotechnology we can start to do some of these very refined things, but realize that what we're talking about has an applied community action side of things, which is sort of what you're doing in this particular situation today with Virginia Theatre. But there needs to be people who are interested in taking that matter further. And so if you can get excited by this one insect and then perhaps other insects too, but we do have to have habitat. And people like the Nature Conservancy realize that railroad lines are not enough to give you enough area. So they tend to buy up large tracts of land, and then there's one in Kankakee River Basin, part mainly in Indiana, I think. But they're planting it to a variety of pollinators, as well as just the grasses, and giving it the diversity that they want.
Could I pop in here really quickly? There's something, while everyone else is talking and the listeners are listening, I get to watch two of these caterpillars that have come up and they're right in front of me, and they've discovered each other, and one of them is kind of, I don't know if they sniff or what. Are they friendly to each other? And while you folks are talking about the relationship between one caterpillar and another, I'm going to go over to the camera and see if I can't zoom in on these guys, because it's fascinating. I'm still listening, but it's been fascinating to watch these two suddenly realize, oh, there's another one here, and I may have missed my opportunity. They may not be paying attention to each other. But are there rivalries among them? Do the boys hate each other because of sexual, rivalries and things like that?
Rivalry,
yes, exactly.
They pound each other with their
exactly
tubercles.
with their horns, right? Yeah.
Those are tubercles, and they whack each other. They're generally, I think it's only when one is eating on a milkweed leaf and another one or two come up that they'll sort of whack each other with their head, trying to get them. This is my plate.
Right,
This is my food. Please find your other food, your other plate of food.
Well, now, Cindy, you have a film too.
Yes.
And Sydney comes from Paxton's.
Yeah.
So she asked her the other day whether she was Scandinavian, and yes.
Yes, actually, my great-great-grandfather immigrated to America from Norway. So I've got about a quarter Norwegian in me, Scandinavian. And he was a farmer, so I feel sort of like farming in my background.
Does that mean you feel like destroying prairie and
No.
putting corn
No.
in its place?
But it seems like I've gotten to have this very much of a concern of the monarch and the decline, and so I'm trying to build up the population, Kirby and I, by raising and releasing monarchs. And my film is kind of a result of this, is during this whole time period of these years of raising and releasing monarchs, we've had some real memorable experiences related to the butterflies. And so part of that is in the film, and then also other people have shared with us some of their butterfly experiences. So in the film that I've been working on, Touched by a Butterfly, there are 8 different stories in which people tell of an experience that had effect upon them with a butterfly.
And you have children that get involved in this
Yes,
too.
yes, children, it's real interesting, from young children all on up to seniors are fascinated. Just the whole life cycle of the caterpillar to the butterfly, it just really fascinates everybody.
So in Paxton, you have a cemetery that has a prairie on it that's very well known, and there's a tendency for people to want to mow a cemetery because the ancestors should be respected. The ancestors in some of these prairie cemeteries were here with a covered wagon and passed, and they were buried in a prairie, and the prairie remains. Unfortunately, many of those little cemeteries have been taken over by township supervisors, and I just went to Jesse Cemetery in Villa Grove, and an excellent prairie cemetery. And I've been watching it for the last few years because the prairie plants have been going, but they mow it and herbicide around the graves. And so even right today, we're taking out the habitat that we could.
It's disheartening when that happens. When I see a farmer mowing a roadside that has swamp milkweed or compass plants or prairie dock or
Yes, these are deep-rooted plants.
It breaks my heart. It makes me a little sick to my stomach when, there's only 3 to 4 feet between the edge of the corn and the edge of the road, and that's a tiny little strip. Surely we can let a 3 to 4 foot strip grow with native plant. They're not going to get in the field because they've all been sprayed with Roundup. So they're limited to the ditch. They're no threat to the field. I understand why
there are alligators and giraffes and elephants in those.
Why
those
we
3
cannot
feet,
let those grow.
They go in and they
It's
stop on the
extremely
corn and the
frustrating.
soybeans.
Extremely frustrating. Yeah.
So yes,
That's where the bad hitchhikers hide, is in the tall prairie grass. So
yes,
we have to mow it to
take
keep
down.
them.
So Cindy, you knew a gentleman that we know well in ecological, Steve.
Herb Stevens?
Herb Stevens.
Oh, yes, yes.
A bald gentleman who was in Paxton, and he would be very supportive of the sorts of things we're talking about, the preservation of.
Yes, he was the owner of the Little Paxton Record newspaper, and he was a very much a liberal, progressive
Yes.
Person. Yes, and even at one time, Paxton had the red fox squirrels in town, and they were getting overrun by the gray squirrels. And I remember her putting up a big billboard, in support, try to save the red fox squirrels.
Yes, and he would put money into preservation type work. But right south of Paxton, you have a railroad prairie. There is what used to be the Illinois Central, but now is Canadian National Railroad. And then there was an interurban rail. And then there was a concrete road, which was a gravel road. And where it was swampy, you had a corduroy road, which is where you would take trees if you could find them, and or you'd bring them in from another county if you wanted to put them down and make it more possible for a horse and cart to move over. So that road is still there. And just south of Paxton is very good prairie.
Yes, we've really
Yeah.
admired that.
Yeah,
Yes.
I don't, Grand Prairie Friends used to take care of that, and I don't know who is now, but there's getting some weed trees in there that need
Yes,
cut
Russian
down.
olive
that,
especially.
There's some autumn olive and some, I don't know if there's any multiflora rose yet, but there's some invasives that need to be taken out.
We have evil intent of thinking about taking interested parties off the 57 highway at Kankakee and having them run through Otto, which is where there are dunes that are created by drying glacial meltways, which dried up after glaciation moved north. And those dunes support a very interesting dryish prairie. And then you come down to Shabance and you crawl over off 57, you're on the adjacent to the railroad. And you may not know it, but it's also loaded with interesting prairie. And you can go through all those little towns to Loda, whereas the Grand Prairie Friends has a
There's
plot.
a cemetery.
There's a cemetery plot there that's wonderful. And actually on the railroad itself is loaded with prairie. And then you come down further to Paxton, and then we would like to have at Rantoul, we have a quasi remnant prairie, and it's north of a cemetery there, and the triangle is a mixture of the seeds that come across from the railroad and the interurban and the old road to Egypt, and so there's a gravel pit there, and the gravel pit is like 8 feet removed gravel. It's glacial till. It's very good for roads. It's called a borrow pit, but you don't ever bring the borrowed land back. So it's 8 feet of ground has been removed, and you're going through regrowth succession as if you were coming from 10,000 years ago to now. And can we move that, speed that process up? And so
it's a shame that no one had the foresight when we were destroying the tallgrass prairie, which was 22 million acres in Illinois. It's to me a crying shame that somewhere we couldn't have preserved a 10-mile by 10-mile piece of this prairie just to study it and see what we had. And because I know we've lost, there's insects that are gone and birds that are gone just because it
Even the prairie
went
chicken
so
is gone.
fast.
The
It
prairie
is
chicken-
for all purposes gone.
we could harvest thousands of prairie chickens and send them to Chicago on a train with ice and whatnot.
Yeah.
And now there are so few prairie chickens that they've had to go to Missouri to bring back breeding stock.
But just how short-sighted it was that I would have loved, and that's the problem I think with one of the problems in trying to convince people that doing prairie is the right thing is there's no reference point. They have no big prairie to look at to be inspired by.
Yes.
And to say, and see all the flowers and the grasses and the birds and the butterflies, and we don't have any large piece of this. People haven't grown up with this, and so because there's no frame of reference, it makes it more challenging and difficult to show people this is what we should be putting back.
That's why it's rather wonderful to have a big dig with prairie in it, and to have a pocket prairie across the road, which is an amazing thing to some people. They don't exactly know it. It looks like weeds, but it's really quite marvelous to know about. So tell me a little bit more about what you're going to do this afternoon. You got 2 films. How long are they?
My film is called A Landscape for Life, and it is 31 minutes long. And then Cindy's is...
It's called Touched by a Butterfly, and it's a little bit over 26 minutes.
So we'll have them both shown within an hour. They go from 2 to 3 And we should have it done by 3, a little bit after 3. And then ordinarily we answer questions after the films for anybody that, might have a question. But the Park District scheduled it this time, we're just going to be outside at a table, and we have some books that we've done previously so we're going to be selling our books and just be outside sitting at a table.
Well, you have another vocation. You're independent authors and photographers, and you do things together here, and so you have a dogtown industry. Which
We do. We
you
have
dress up dogs.
We have a dog sideline where we kidnap our dogs and give them lots of treats, and we dress them up partially and photograph them and turn them into dog people, dogs with 2 legs instead of 4, and so we do that. We don't do that as much as we had been doing. We've kind of gotten more in the butterflies, and then I also manage an art gallery in downtown Tuscola that's taken a chunk of my time. But we have our artwork at the gallery in Tuscola, and we've got the work of about 50 artists there. So
Tuscola is where a couple of railroad lines intersect, I think.
yeah, busy ones.
Yes,
Tuscola is a busy
And
train town.
you're about to have an industry that is coming in, perhaps. I don't know.
Perhaps it's looking. The longer it goes on, the less and less likely I think it seems. It's a fertilizer plant that, to be honest, I don't think a lot of people are that excited about. But I'm not excited about it just because I think for the potential of environmental damage and air pollution from the fertilizer plant. So, and so I don't know that they have their financing in order. So I'm hoping it doesn't come.
Well, let me have a look at the time here.
You have 12 minutes.
Okay. One of the interesting things is that you're both fairly local. You've come from Collinsville or down that way, Casey.
Casey, yeah.
And
Casey and Robinson.
And Cindy, you come from Paxton. You've moved around a little bit. Does that mean you leave a little prairie wherever you were?
We try to. We try to leave a little prairie. Our first one was when we lived in the country near Posodum, I put in a half an acre of reconstructed prairie. A little too much grass, but that was my fault.
Well, no, everyone was doing it, including the Department of Natural
Resources, where you go to many of the parks they were seeding in the 70s, they're all grass.
And the rest stops, like at Posodum, was mainly grasses.
Yeah.
That's what we knew about in the 60s.
Yeah. Well, and I think the emphasis was on pheasants and things like that, but
yes, Pheasants Forever is a hunting group, and so the pheasants hide in those sorts of situations, but they also can handle the more biodiversity.
Yeah, and that's those prairie reconstructions, I think, did a lot of damage in the sense of not only did they do damage because they don't you don't have great varieties of insect and bird life in those, but they also create the illusion that a prairie is nothing but a wall of grass, and that, yes. And so many people have that view, that stereotype that, oh, a prairie, it's nothing but a wall of grass, and that is the damage I think that landscaping did.
Sometimes there have been areas around a cemetery prairie, like at Rankin. There was a planting of grasses around the cemetery, but there's a tendency to invade. So that support area that was put in by conservationists had to be removed to allow for more biodiversity. There's also another thing that is rather difficult. When we do have a little prairie, there's a tendency for it to fall over. and that means that the mowers tend to want to move in and take out the plants that have fallen over. So people like John Taft have done a fair bit of research to say that the prairies that we do have are getting smaller because we keep mowing them. And so if you have a 4-foot mower, it's better to have a 5-foot mower, and you can take out 6 inches of prairie on either side. Then you run it through once, and then you run it through twice, so that you get an 8-foot walkway. And very quickly, we've lost the little prairies that we have.
Yeah, and that touches on something else that's kind of a bugaboo of mine, is the overburning the prairie. A prairie gets healthier after a burn, at least part of it, but we often burn prairies way too often. They shouldn't be burned once every 5 years, and then even only part of the prairie should be burned, because you've got all these thousands of overwintering insects that when you burn the prairie, you're killing all those overwintering insects, and some of them are quite rare, and you never know exactly where they're going to overwinter. And so when you people that burn prairie every year are going to end up with less and less and less insect life and a less healthy prairie because of overburning.
And if there's a tendency to want to burn everything, because
men like to burn stuff. There's something about fire and man that.
So they can't leave a patch, and I say no. That's we're leaving that for those creatures. So, tell me, this is a kind of interesting. Women do a lot of the preservation work in the turn of the century, especially women. Once they had their families, they didn't go to work. They often were in front of the city nabobs asking questions about, so they do a lot of conservation work. Have you noticed, as you work around, what is the relationship of women involved in this sort of thing?
Well, one person that particularly comes to mind is also featured in the A Landscape for Life movie, and it's a friend of mine, Nancy Smith, and she's married to a farmer. It's been in their farm for over a century. And anyway, she found milkweed growing in the ditch, and she was able to convince her husband to mow around the milkweed. So women can have a big influence on change, I think. So I think that, sometimes that can make a big difference. And then the other person that comes to mind is a young woman in Tuscola who raises organic vegetables, has a little girl. The city of Tuscola had been spraying for mosquitoes, and she didn't want that to happen. And so she and Kirby and I approached the city council and talked with them and convinced them not to spray for mosquitoes. So she also
Because
a young
it
woman.
kills
Yeah, because it kills everything.
It kills everything. It's not mosquito specific. It kills everything. All the insects.
Butterflies,
moths,
honeybees, everything.
lightning bugs, everything.
And some of the herbicide is systemic, so you don't have to spray a lot of it. It takes out the plant, the total plant, and as it gets to be that the plants get used to it, then we're bringing in other herbicides which are much more prone to be distributed by wind and somewhat more spongy. So we're coming to a time when we can't have herbicides around the world. The roadsides have found them, the railroads have found them, they're used extensively, but we need to talk to people who are using the herbicides. I was talking to Vaden the other day. He's a prairie sort of person, and he had been looking at a orange milkweed, and somebody said to him, "What is that?" And he said, "It's orange milkweed." And the woman who was there suddenly sort of retreated from it, because she had probably grown up in the era when she and her brothers and sisters were all out there getting rid of milkweeds in the cornfield. In those days, it wasn't always cornfield. it was starting to be soybeans. And where did the soybeans come from? They come from genetics that's in that prairie or in that habitat around the world. So before 1936, you didn't have soybeans. Now we're looking for a soybean that might be perennial. So you mow it for 20 years, and then it saves the erosion that occurs with annual planting. So, yeah.
We're almost out of time. I wanted to jump in here for two things. First, the reason we're talking about pollinators today is because there's an event over at the try that again, across the street at the Virginia Theater right here in downtown Champaign, starting at 2 o'clock for an hour. We'll be watching movies by Cindy and Kirby Pringle, who you've been listening to today, and then they'll move outside and talk some more with folks and sign books and things like that. Now, there's a lot more. You touched on the fact that monarchs may be one of the most spectacular, but they're far from the only pollinator in the game. What are some other kinds of plants that people could have, something besides just milkweed, that would appeal to the other things that are out there?
Well, plants that we like that provide a lot of nectar, that seem to attract a lot of butterflies and bees, is bergamot. It seems to be a really good plant. Prairie blazing star is another plant that has a lot of nectar that attracts butterflies. And there are other different kinds of milkweed. There's red milkweed and green milkweed, Sullivan's milkweed that aren't as weedy as common milkweed and won't take over a garden. And in the fall, New England asters are a really good plant. Asters, a plant called boneset, and goldenrod. A lot of people don't like goldenrod because it spreads, but that to me is the plant that really fuels the monarch on its fall journey. It's got a lot of nectar. So goldenrod is one of my favorites, but not a favorite of mine.
There are also cultivated plants. If you go to the West Side Park, just opposite the church that's there, there's a nice plot with a little label which says something about pollinators, and you can register there, and you can register the pollinators you see. So I think this is
Pretty close.
This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and our guests have been Cindy and Kirby Prairie. And thank you very much for coming.
Prairie Pringle Monk.
There you go.
Prairie
The new
Pringle.
nickname. We've got
Prairie
the
Pringle Monk.
Where did the Pringle come from? Where did you
Prairie Pringle Monk.
Yeah, no, Prairie Monk meets the Prairie Pringles.
I got mixed up.
There you go. That's perfect. How great is that? Wow. And Dave on the board.
You actually have in your film some soundtrack that's done from Norway.
Yes, my cousin in Norway. Yeah, I was really thrilled that he's a musician over there. So yeah, we got some Norwegian music
Oh, this
there.
is a little thing that comes.
And I'll take over here for a second. As always, we have to point out that the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers.